My name is Ethan. I'm 46 years old, and for the last 20 years of my life, I worked as a structural engineer. Before that, I spent 6 years in the Army, 10th Mountain Division. I've always been a man who believes in physics, in measurable stress and strain, in the predictable and explainable world. I grew up in South Dakota, and the Black Hills were my backyard. I learned to hunt there, to track, to read the land. I was comfortable in the woods, more at home there than in any city. I'm telling you this not to brag, but to establish a baseline. I am not a man given to flights of fancy or superstition. What I am about to recount is not a story, it is a report. It is the reason I no longer live in South Dakota. It is the reason I will never set foot in a forest again. It happened in the autumn of 2016. The air was getting that sharp, clean bite to it, and the aspens were turning the canyons into rivers of gold. It was our annual trip, myself, Cal, Brian, and Corey. We'd been doing it for over a decade, ever since we all got out of the service. Cal and I were in the 10th Mountain together. Corey had been a Marine Scout sniper, quiet and unnervingly observant. Brian was the outlier. He'd been an Army cook who'd never seen a day of combat, but he was Cal's cousin, and his good humor was infectious. He was the glue, the one who kept the rest of us from getting too grim. We'd rented a cabin for the week. It was more remote than our usual spots. The rental listing called it secluded, which was an understatement. It was at the end of a 10-mile gravel road that was barely more than a glorified logging trail, deep in a part of the Black Hills National Forest that wasn't frequented by tourists. The cabin itself was old but solid, built from thick, dark logs, with a wide stone fireplace and a covered porch. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by a dense wall of ponderosa pine and spruce. The nearest sign of civilization was a ranger station 20 miles back. It was perfect. The isolation was the point. We spent the first day settling in, unpacking our gear. Hunting rifles were cleaned and sighted, packs were organized, and a small mountain of food and beer was stowed away. The mood was light. Brian was already making terrible jokes, claiming the clicking of his new thermal scope was the sound of a tactical squirrel preparing to invade. Corey, in his typical fashion, said nothing, but did a slow, methodical perimeter check of the cabin and the immediate tree line, his eyes missing nothing. Cal and I were poring over topographical maps on the heavy oak table, planning our deer hunt for the following days. It felt normal. It felt safe. The familiar ritual of men retreating into the wilderness. The first wrong thing happened that night. We were sitting around the fire, the flames popping and hissing, the smell of pine and wood smoke thick in the air. We were a few beers in, swapping the same old stories we always did. Outside, the world had gone completely silent. That was the first thing I noticed. Usually, even on a still night, you hear something. Crickets, the rustle of a nocturnal animal, the distant call of an owl. But there was nothing. A profound, unnatural quiet that felt like the world was holding its breath. I mentioned it to Cal. "You notice how quiet it is?" He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the dark windows. "Yeah, dead calm, no wind." Corey, who was cleaning his rifle for the third time that day, looked up. "Too quiet," he murmured, and went back to his work. Brian just laughed. "You guys are getting jumpy in your old age. It's called peace and quiet. This is what we paid for." He was probably right, I thought. We were city dwellers now, unused to true silence. I tried to dismiss it, to chalk it up to our overactive senses, honed by years of training to look for threats where there were none. Later, after we'd all turned in, I was woken up by a sound. It was a low, rhythmic thudding against the outside wall of the cabin near the corner where my bunk was. Thud. Thud. Thud.
It wasn't loud, but it was heavy and deliberate. My first thought was an animal, a big buck rubbing its antlers against the logs maybe, or a bear scratching an itch. I lay there listening, every nerve ending suddenly on high alert. The sound continued for about a minute, a steady, patient rhythm, and then it stopped as abruptly as it began. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but the oppressive silence had returned. The next morning I told the others. Brian immediately had a theory. Giant insomniac woodpecker. The Black Hills are famous for them. Cal and Corey were less dismissive. We went outside to check. The wall was made of massive, creosoted logs, at least a foot thick. There were no marks, no scratches, no indentations, no bits of bark rubbed off. Nothing.
If a bear had been rubbing against it with enough force to make that sound, it would have left some sign. Corey ran his hand over the logs, his brow furrowed. Whatever it was tall, he said, pointing to a spot about 7 feet up. The sound was coming from up here. We all looked at the spot. A buck couldn't reach that high. A bear would have to be standing on its hind legs, and even then, why would it just knock? There was no logical explanation, and that seed of unease, planted by the silence the night before, began to sprout a tiny, cold root in my gut. We decided to press on with our plans. We were hunters, after all, and the woods were our domain. We split into 2 teams. Cal and I would head east, towards a ridge we knew was a good game trail. Corey and Brian would go west, into a denser, rockier section of the forest. We agreed to keep in touch via our radios, checking in every hour. The day was bright and clear, the air crisp. As Cal and I moved through the trees, the unease from the night before started to fade, replaced by the familiar focus of the hunt. The forest felt normal again. We saw squirrels, chipmunks, the flash of a blue jay. The world was back to its regular rhythm. We found a good vantage point on the ridge and settled in to wait. Hours passed. Nothing. Not a single deer. Not even a track that was fresh. It was strange. This area had always been productive. Around noon, Cal broke the silence. "This is weird, Ethan. It's like the whole forest is empty." He was right. We hadn't seen so much as a doe all morning. It felt like all the animals had cleared out, moved on to somewhere else. It was another piece that didn't fit the puzzle. Our 1 o'clock radio check-in with Corey and Brian went as scheduled. They reported the same thing. No game, an eerie lack of animal sign. Brian joked that maybe his tactical squirrel had warned everyone we were coming. Corey's voice when he came on was clipped. "Something's not right out here. We found something." Before he could elaborate, the radio crackled with static and his voice was lost. I tried to raise them again. "Corey, repeat your last. What did you find?" Nothing but static. Cal and I exchanged a worried look. Radio dead zones were common in the hills, but the timing was unsettling. We waited for the 2 o'clock check-in, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. It never came. We tried raising them again and again. "Corey, Brian, this is Ethan. Do you copy?" Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, full of negative space. After another 10 minutes of failed attempts, Cal made the call. "Screw this, we're going after them." The hunt was over. Now it was a search. We packed up our gear and started moving west, towards their last known position, our pace fast and purposeful. The forest no longer felt like a place of recreation. It felt hostile. It took us nearly 2 hours of hard hiking to get to the area we'd agreed they would cover. The terrain got rougher, the trees thicker, the ground littered with granite outcroppings. We called their names, our voices sounding small and thin in the vast woods. "Corey! Brian!" Only the wind in the pines answered. And then we found it.
It was a small clearing, dominated by a huge, gnarled old pine tree. At the base of the tree was Brian's pack. It was lying on the ground, one of the straps torn clean through. A few feet away was his rifle. It wasn't dropped, it was bent, the barrel curved into an impossible arc, the wooden stock splintered. A rifle barrel is made of hardened steel. To bend it like that would require immense, inhuman force. My blood ran cold. Cal let out a low whistle. What in God's name could do that? We scanned the area, our own rifles held at the ready. There was a story here, and it was a violent one.
There were scuff marks in the dirt, deep gouges in the pine tree's bark, and a few dark, reddish-brown splashes on the fallen leaves. We didn't need a lab to tell us it was blood, but there were no bodies, no drag marks, no sign of Corey at all. Just Brian's abandoned gear and the chilling evidence of a struggle against something impossibly strong. Then Cal pointed to the ground. "Ethan, look." He was pointing at a set of tracks. They were huge, far larger than any boot print. They were also deeply pressed into the hard-packed earth, indicating something of incredible weight. But the shape was the most disturbing part. They were not bear tracks. They were elongated, almost like a canine's, but with a distinct heel pad and what looked like 5 long, clawed toes. And the stride was enormous. They were bipedal. Whatever made these tracks walked on 2 legs. We followed them for about 20 yards. They led from the clearing into the dense woods, and then they just vanished on the rocky ground, as if the creature that made them had simply disappeared into the trees. The sun was beginning to dip below the ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature was dropping fast. We had a decision to make. Search for our friends in the dark, in a forest that now held a palpable sense of menace, or retreat to the relative safety of the cabin and hope they would somehow make their way back. Corey was a Marine. If anyone could survive out here, it was him. Maybe he and Brian were together, evading whatever they had encountered. "We go back to the cabin," I said, the words feeling like a betrayal. "We fortify and we wait. We can't do anything for them stumbling around in the dark." Cal nodded, his face grim. The walk back was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to move. Every snap of a twig made us spin around, rifles raised. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague suspicion. It was a certainty. We were being hunted. We reached the cabin as the last light of day bled from the sky. The clearing was shrouded in deep twilight. The cabin, which had seemed so welcoming just that morning, now looked like a flimsy wooden box in a sea of darkness. We didn't bother taking off our boots. I immediately went to the windows, checking the locks and drawing the heavy curtains. Cal started building a massive fire in the hearth, not for warmth, but for light. We needed to banish the shadows. We turned on every lamp in the small building, creating a pocket of defiant brightness against the encroaching night. We didn't talk much. We just worked. We piled the extra firewood against the inside of the door, creating a makeshift barricade. We checked our ammunition. I had my .30-06 hunting rifle and a .45 pistol. Cal had a similar setup. It felt woefully inadequate against whatever could bend a rifle barrel with its bare hands. We sat at the table, our weapons resting in our laps, and we waited. The silence returned, thicker and more menacing than the night before. It was a listening silence, the silence of a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of my own heart. Around midnight, it started. A faint scratching sound at the back of the cabin. It was delicate, exploratory. A single claw, perhaps, tracing the line of a window frame. Cal and I froze, our eyes meeting across the room. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. The scratching stopped. A few minutes later, we heard a soft thud on the roof. Then another. Something was up there, walking on the shingles. It was heavy, each footfall making the rafters groan almost imperceptibly. It paced back and forth, from one end of the roof to the other, for what felt like an eternity. It was testing the structure, I realized, probing for a weakness. This wasn't a mindless beast. This was intelligent. It was thinking, problem-solving. The sheer wrongness of it was terrifying. Animals don't do this. They don't conduct tactical assessments of a building. The pacing stopped directly over the stone chimney. We heard a new sound, a low, guttural sniffing, amplified as it came down the flue. It was smelling us, cataloging us. The sound was wet and raspy, the sound of a massive predator's breath. Then came the voice. It was a garbled, distorted mimicry of a human voice, and it spoke a single word from the chimney. "Help!" It was a twisted, broken version of Brian's voice. My stomach turned to ice. It was a lure. It was trying to draw us out. Cal cursed under his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. "Don't listen," I whispered, my own voice trembling. "It's a trick." The thing on the roof let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound of frustration that vibrated through the very logs of the cabin. It knew we hadn't fallen for it. The real assault began then. A tremendous impact shook the entire cabin, as if a truck had hit it. A deep, splintering crack echoed from the front door. It hit it again, and again. The barricade of firewood shuddered, some of the logs tumbling to the floor. Through the small peephole, I could see nothing but a wall of dark fur pressed against the door. Whatever it was huge. At the same time, another crash came from the side of the cabin as a window shattered, glass exploding inwards. A long, dark arm, impossibly thin and jointed at a sickening angle, snaked through the broken pane, clawed fingers grasping, searching. Cal reacted instantly. He fired his rifle, the boom deafening in the enclosed space. The arm recoiled with a wet, shrieking howl of pain that was unlike any animal I had ever heard. It was a sound of agony and rage mixed together. From outside, the howl was answered by another, and then a third. There were more of them. We weren't dealing with a single creature. We were surrounded. My military training kicked in, a cold, desperate clarity cutting through the terror. "The windows!" I yelled. "Stay away from the windows!" We scrambled away from the walls, taking up positions near the center of the room, using the heavy oak table as partial cover. The things outside went into a frenzy. They were throwing themselves against the walls, the force of the impacts making the lamps flicker and the floorboards tremble. The sound was a cacophony of splintering wood, guttural snarls, and the high-pitched screams of enraged predators. One of them began to tear at the logs near the broken window, ripping away huge splinters of wood with its claws. I could see its shape silhouetted against the moonlight now. It was a nightmare given form. It stood on two legs that were bent backward like a dog's, but it had the torso and broad shoulders of a gorilla. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees, ending in hands that were unnervingly human-like, except for the thick black talons that tipped each finger. And its head was purely, horribly canine. A long muzzle filled with yellow fangs, pointed ears, and eyes that glowed with a faint predatory phosphorescence. It was at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, a dog that walked like a man. I fired my rifle. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, spinning it around. It roared, a sound that shook my bones, but it didn't fall. It barely even seemed to notice the wound beyond a momentary flinch. It just turned back to its work, tearing at the wall with renewed fury. Cal was firing too, methodically, trying to place his shots, but they were too fast, too strong. For every one we drove back from a window, another would start tearing at a different part of the cabin. It was a coordinated attack. They were trying to breach us from multiple points at once. One of them found a new tool. We heard a heavy scraping sound from the front porch, and then the massive stone fire pit ring we'd used for our campfire came crashing through the main front window, showering the room in glass and rock. The creature that had thrown it, a beast even larger than the others, immediately tried to climb through the opening. I emptied my .45 into its chest. The heavy slugs staggered it, punching dark holes in its matted fur, but it just kept coming, its jaws snapping, saliva flying from its teeth. This was it. This was how we died, torn apart in a remote cabin by monsters from a campfire story. But then I saw him. Corey. He stepped out of the tree line at the edge of the clearing, a dark, silent shape against the snow-dusted ground I just now noticed had begun to fall. He wasn't running. He was moving with the calm, deadly economy of a lifelong soldier. In his hands, he held a hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. He had a pistol tucked into his belt, but he wasn't using it. One of the creatures, smaller than the others, had been circling the cabin, and it turned to face this new threat. It charged Corey, a blur of dark fur and claws. Corey didn't back down. He sidestepped the initial lunge with a grace that defied his size, and as the beast went past him, he drove the knife deep into the side of its neck, just below the jaw. He used the creature's own momentum, twisting the blade and pulling it free in a single, fluid motion. The beast stumbled, a fountain of black blood erupting from the wound. It took a few more steps, clawed at its own throat, and collapsed into the snow. The other creatures stopped their assault on the cabin. They turned their glowing eyes towards Corey, a low, unified growl rising from their chests. The massive one that was halfway through our window pulled itself back out, its attention now completely fixed on the man who had just killed one of its pack. Corey stood his ground, the bloody knife held low and ready. He had created a diversion. He was drawing them away from us. He was sacrificing himself. "Go!" His voice cut through the night, a sharp, clear command. "Get to the truck! Go now!" He knew, and we knew, that he wasn't going to win that fight. He was just buying us time. A few precious seconds. Cal and I looked at each other. There was no time to argue, no time to be heroes. To stay would be to waste his sacrifice. "The back door!" I yelled. We kicked away the remains of our flimsy barricade and threw the door open. The cold night air hit us like a slap in the face. Behind us, we heard the monsters charge, their roars echoing through the clearing as they converged on Corey. We didn't look back. We sprinted across the small clearing and towards the gravel road where our truck was parked. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead. The sounds of the fight behind us were horrific. The roars of the beasts, a single defiant yell from Corey, and then a final, terrible, wet tearing sound, followed by silence. He had bought us maybe 30 seconds. It had to be enough. We reached the truck, fumbling with the keys. I jumped into the driver's seat, Cal into the passenger side. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned. Nothing. Just a series of dead clicks. "No, no, no," I muttered, trying again. Click, click, click. Cal was already leaning over me, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness under the dashboard. "The wires are cut," he said, his voice flat and dead. "They cut the ignition wires." Of course they did. They were smart. They had planned this. They had disabled our vehicle before the siege even began. They had herded us into a box and taken away our only means of escape. We were stranded. 10 miles of logging road between us and anything resembling safety. with a pack of intelligent, 8-foot-tall canine monsters somewhere behind us in the dark. We had no choice. "We run," I said. "We stick to the road. We just run." We abandoned the useless truck and started down the gravel road, a desperate, stumbling jog into the oppressive darkness. The snow was falling a little thicker now, small white flakes swirling in the beams of our flashlights.
It did little to hide the path, but it seemed to muffle the sound, creating an eerie, insulated world of just the two of us, our ragged breaths and the crunch of our boots on the gravel. Every few minutes we would switch off our lights and listen, straining to hear any sound of pursuit over the blood pounding in our ears. For the first mile there was nothing, just the wind. Maybe they were content with their kills. Maybe Corey and Brian were enough. It was a foolish, desperate hope. Around the 2nd-mile marker we heard it, a long, mournful howl that cut through the night, closer than we wanted. It was answered by another, off to our left, in the woods that ran parallel to the road. They weren't just following us, they were flanking us, herding us. Panic began to set in, a cold, sharp-edged thing that threatened to overwhelm my training. I forced it down. Panic gets you killed. I focused on the procedure. Move, listen, assess. Cal was right beside me, his face a pale, grim mask in the intermittent flashes of his light. We were both experienced outdoorsmen. We were both soldiers. But we were being hunted by something that defied every rule of nature we had ever learned. Our rifles felt like toys. We pushed harder, breaking into a full sprint whenever the road was clear, slowing to a walk only when our lungs felt like they were about to burst. The howls kept pace with us, sometimes falling back, sometimes drawing alarmingly close. We could hear them crashing through the underbrush just beyond the tree line, massive bodies moving with terrifying speed. They were playing with us. They knew we had nowhere to go. At one point, one of them broke from the trees and appeared on the road ahead of us, about 100 yards away. It stood there, a towering black silhouette against the snow-dusted road, its head cocked as if it were curious. It made no move to attack. It just watched us.
We skidded to a halt, raising our rifles. I sighted down the barrel, my front post centered on its massive chest. But my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold it steady. Before either of us could fire, it turned and melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. It was a message. "We see you. We are all around you. You cannot escape." The next few miles were a blur of sheer terror and exhaustion. My body was running on pure adrenaline. My mind was a loop of Corey's last command, the image of the bent rifle, the sound of that thing sniffing at the chimney. We lost track of time. We just ran. The road stretched on endlessly before us, a pale ribbon of gravel in the dark. We fell. We got up. We kept going. Cal twisted his ankle at one point, and for a few hundred yards I had to half carry him, his arms slung over my shoulder. The sounds in the woods grew bolder, closer. We could hear their guttural snarls, the heavy panting of their breath. Just when I thought we couldn't take another step, that we would collapse on the road and wait for the end, I saw it. A faint, flickering light through the trees ahead. It was yellowish and steady. It wasn't a flashlight. It was electric light. Civilization. Hope surged through me, a powerful, intoxicating wave. "Cal, look!" I gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. "A light!" We found a new reserve of strength. We staggered, ran, and stumbled towards it. The howls behind us seemed to grow more frantic, more enraged, as if they knew their prey was about to slip through their claws. We burst out of the logging road and onto a paved, 2-lane county highway. The light was coming from the porch of a small, isolated house about 50 yards down the road. We ran for it, our boots slapping on the asphalt. We didn't care who lived there. We just needed a door to put between us and the things in the woods. We scrambled onto the porch and began pounding on the door, screaming for help, Please, help us. Open the door. Lights came on inside. A face appeared in the window, an old man with a frightened expression. He yelled something we couldn't understand through the thick door. I pointed back towards the woods, my voice cracking. We're being hunted. Please, you have to let us in. Just then, one of the creatures broke through the tree line and stood at the edge of the logging road, bathed in the glow of the porch light. It was the massive one. It stood there on its canine legs, its fur matted with snow and something dark that I knew was Corey's blood. Its yellow eyes burned with a cold, intelligent hatred. It lifted its head and let out a roar of pure fury that shook the very air. That was enough for the old man. The door flew open and he pulled us inside, slamming and bolting it behind us. We collapsed onto the floor of his small living room, gasping for air, shaking uncontrollably.
The old man, who introduced himself as Mr. Harris, was on the phone, talking to the sheriff's department. Cal and I were alive. We were safe. The siege was over. But the war inside my head was just beginning. The sheriff's deputies arrived about 40 minutes later. 2 of them. A younger, clean-cut deputy and an older, world-weary sergeant with a thick mustache and tired eyes. We were still in shock, wrapped in blankets Mr. Harris had given us, sipping hot coffee that we could barely hold steady. We tried to tell them what happened. I started from the beginning, the missing friends, the bent rifle, the tracks, the siege on the cabin, Corey's sacrifice, the chase through the woods. I watched their faces as I spoke. The young deputy's expression went from concern to confusion to outright disbelief. The sergeant just listened, his face impassive, occasionally jotting something down in a small notebook.
When I got to the part about the 8-foot-tall, bipedal dog creatures, the young deputy actually snorted. He tried to cover it with a cough, but I saw it. To them, we were just 2 guys who had gotten lost in the woods, gotten spooked by a bear, and were either drunk, high, or crazy. So, let me get this straight, the sergeant said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. You're telling me you were attacked by werewolves? I'm not telling you they were werewolves, I snapped, my frustration boiling over. I don't know what they were. I'm telling you what we saw. Our friends are missing. One of them is dead. You need to get a search party up to that cabin. They took our statements, but it was clear they didn't believe a word of it. They kept asking how much we'd had to drink. They suggested that we'd probably shot at a bear, and our friends had gotten scared and run off, and were probably holed up somewhere, waiting for morning.
They promised they would send a ranger up to the cabin to check things out in the morning.
Morning. By morning, there would be nothing left of Corey but bones. Cal and I were taken to the nearest hospital to be checked out. We had cuts, bruises, and Cal had a sprained ankle, but otherwise, we were physically unharmed. The psychological damage was another story. We spent the night under observation, not for our injuries, but because the emergency room doctor, after hearing our story from the deputies, had put us on a psychiatric hold. We were the crazy ones. The victims were being treated like suspects. The next day, the official story came down. A park ranger had driven up to the cabin. He found it damaged by a bear. The ranger reported finding large, unusual but inconclusive animal tracks in the area. Our friends, Brian and Corey, were officially listed as missing. A search was organized, but it was half-hearted.
They found scraps of Brian's clothing a few days later, torn and bloody. The official cause of his disappearance was ruled a probable bear attack. They never found a single trace of Corey. Not a boot, not a button, not his knife. Nothing. It was as if he had been erased from the earth. The case was closed. Cal and I were released from the hospital with a prescription for sedatives and a recommendation for grief counseling. Our rifles were returned to us. The investigation was over.
We were told not to go back into that area of the forest as it was clearly home to an aggressive bear population. It was a neat, tidy, official explanation that accounted for everything and explained nothing. It was a lie. We were dismissed, ignored. But just before we left the sheriff's station, the old sergeant pulled me aside. He led me to a quiet corner away from the younger deputy. He looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time, I didn't see condescension.
I saw something that looked like pity. "Son," he said, his voice low, "I've been working these hills for 30 years. Every 5 years or so, we get a story like yours. Hunters go missing. Campers vanish. We find a torn-up tent, some blood, maybe some weird tracks before the rain washes them away. We call it a bear attack. It's easier for everyone." He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "I don't know what you saw up there, but I know this much. Some things have been in these hills a lot longer than we have. They don't like being disturbed. You boys kicked a hornet's nest. You got out alive. That makes you luckier than most. Take it as a win. Go home. Forget you ever saw this place. And for God's sake, stay out of the deep woods." He patted me on the shoulder, a gesture that was both a warning and a strange sort of validation, and then he walked away, leaving me alone with the terrible, isolating truth. That was 6 years ago. Cal and I don't talk much anymore. The shared trauma was too much. It became a wall between us instead of a bridge. He moved to Florida, as far from the mountains as he could get. I moved to a suburb in Ohio, a place where the biggest predator is a fat raccoon. I sold all my hunting gear. I can't even stand to be in a city park after dark. The sight of a large dog still sends a jolt of ice through my veins. I have nightmares every night. I see those glowing yellow eyes. I hear Corey's last yell. I feel the cabin shake. I wake up covered in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I've tried therapy, but how do you tell a therapist you're being haunted by the memory of an 8-foot-tall Dogman without getting committed? So I keep it inside, a poison I swallow every day. I lost 3 friends that week. I lost Brian to his own disbelief. I lost Corey to his bravery. And I lost the man I used to be, the confident, rational engineer who believed the world was a solvable equation. He died in that cabin. In his place is this ghost, this survivor who looks over his shoulder in broad daylight, who sees monsters in every shadow. I know they're still out there, in the Black Hills, in the remote, dark places of the world that we foolishly think we've conquered. That old sergeant was right. We are not the masters of this planet. We are just noisy tenants, and our lease is a lot more fragile than we think. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, and the forest goes unnaturally silent, don't try to explain it away. Don't be a hero. Don't be a skeptic. Just turn around and walk away. Get back in your car and drive until the trees are just a memory. Some things are not meant to be found. Some tracks are not meant to be followed. And some truths, once you learn them, will break you. My name is Ethan, and I am a survivor. And I am telling you, with every fiber of my being, to stay out of the woods.